get us started, just today, a few of our members in our Latin America working group, they were circulating an article you wrote. I think it's titled Biden's Plan for Central America. Could you talk to us about that article?
Absolutely. So, and as many people have probably seen, unfortunately, there's been almost entire continuity with the Biden administration when it comes to the Trump administration's Latin America policy, and really its foreign policy in general. We've seen that Antony Blinken has continued off exactly where Pompeo ended, and we saw, for instance, that Blinken has reaffirmed support for Juan Guaido as the supposed president of Venezuela, which at this point is almost comical. I mean, I can talk more about that later, but just in brief, Guaido, who of course was never elected to be president ever, he's never won a single vote as president. He was only originally elected to be part of the National Assembly, but he's no longer even in the National Assembly. So it's a farce that the U.S. still recognizes him as interim president, given that its own ridiculous excuse that it had used is no longer even relevant. But anyway, we've seen that the Biden administration is continuing to recognize Juan Guaido. The Biden administration is continuing to impose very suffocating sanctions on Venezuela and has said that it might reconsider them, but has not changed them in any way. And I should say that experts at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is one of the only good think tanks in DC, they have estimated that at least 40,000 Venezuelan civilians have died because of those sanctions. And that's likely a very conservative estimate. A former UN Special Rapporteur, who oversaw sanctions policy, top expert on sanctions for the United Nations, Alfred de Zayas, has said that it might be around 100,000 Venezuelan civilians who have died because of the sanctions. So those policies are continuing under the Biden administration. The Biden head of, or rather the spokesperson for the Biden State Department, who is Ned Price, a former CIA agent who now helping to oversee State Department policy. Ned Price has demonized the Sandinista government here in Nicaragua as being on the path to dictatorship, and I can talk more about that. So more continuity there between the Biden and Trump administrations. On Colombia, of course, the Biden administration is continuing to strongly support the extremely right-wing, very violent government there of Ivan Duque. And I should mention that Biden himself has taken credit for Plan Colombia, which I can speak more about in a bit. The U.S. has flooded Colombia with billions of dollars in funding for this program, which has only fueled extreme violence in the country, leading to thousands of deaths. In fact, the Colombian government, they created a special court to investigate the violence in the kind of low-scale internal civil war that's been going on there for years. And the special court recently determined that 6,402 people have been, in a conservative estimate, have been massacred, have been murdered by the Colombian military, and then falsely claimed, the Colombian military then falsely claimed that those people they killed were socialist guerrillas from the FARC or the ELN. So this is a Colombian special court acknowledging that the military, backed by the United States with billions of dollars of funding through Plan Colombia, has massacred thousands of innocent civilians and falsely claimed that they're socialist guerrillas. So the Biden administration is continuing that policy. And then that brings us to Plan Biden. I mentioned Plan Colombia and the fact that Biden has taken credit for Plan Colombia, which was first started under President Bill Clinton. I mean, it's a bipartisan policy that has continued under Republicans, but it was very much a Democratic policy with a capital D, Democratic. And Plan Biden is based on Plan Colombia. In fact, in English, the Biden administration has referred to it as the Biden plan for Central America. And in Spanish, that would be Plan Biden. So what is the Biden plan? Well, when Biden was campaigning to run for president, he almost never talked about foreign policy. If we can remember back to the Democratic primary, it was focused almost entirely on domestic policy. And of course, among the over 1 dozen candidates, Biden was probably the most right wing, or one of the most right wing candidates. And when it came to foreign policy, one of the very few concrete proposals that Biden had was the Biden plan for Central America. You can find it on his campaign website. It actually goes quite into depth explaining what the policy is. In short, the Biden plan is the application of the same strategy used in Plan Colombia to Central America. The Biden administration looks at Central America and sees that this is a very impoverished region, and it has been responsible for a majority of Latin immigration to the United States. So of the Latinos who come to the United States, it's the plurality are no longer Mexicans, actually. The plurality are actually Central Americans from there's a triangle they refer to, the Northern Triangle nations. So depending on your definition of Central America, there are 6 or 7 countries. And the Northern Triangle, the northern half, includes Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Those are the countries that are the least stable in the region and have the most immigrants and refugees. I would say that many of them are actually refugees, not immigrants. They're fleeing violence, they're fleeing organized crime, they're economic refugees, and they're fleeing unemployment and poverty. And of course, I'll talk about the situation in Honduras, which is responsible for the plurality of those Central American immigrants fleeing to the United States. And they are fleeing, in particular, an extremely corrupt right-wing narco regime led by really a dictator who stole the last election, even the Organization of American States, which is an extremely biased body which helped oversee a military coup in Bolivia. But even the Organization of American States has acknowledged that the so-called president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, known by his initials HO, J-O-H, or pronounced Ho in Spanish, he stole the election. And he not only stole the election, but he used drug money to buy votes, to buy the election. And his brother, Tony Hernandez, is currently in prison in the United States and was sentenced, convicted by a federal court in New York for trafficking thousands of kilograms of cocaine into the United States, along with machine guns and other illegal activity. So the Northern Triangle countries are responsible for the plurality of Latin immigration to the United States. The Biden administration sees this situation and has decided that one of their priorities is trying to stop that massive influx of immigration, of refugees. Now, of course, we should encourage any policy that would stop displacing these people from their countries. I mean, we should support refugees and immigrants, of course, in the United States, but also, sure, I mean, the idea of trying to help strengthen countries and economies in Central America is a good idea. Of course, we don't want so many people fleeing their home, and they themselves don't want to flee their home. The idea that thousands and thousands of people just want to take this very dangerous trek up north because they believe that the American dream is so great and the U.S. is such a great country. Of course, we know that's not what's actually happening. It's deeply exaggerated. The reality is that most of these people are refugees. Under international law, they could be considered refugees. But of course, the U.S. asylum laws are so strict, not just under Trump, but they're still strict. They were under Obama, and they are once again strict under Biden, and it makes it very difficult. I mean, honestly, it's very hard to get a visa, yet alone apply for asylum or refugee status. I mean, I know a lot of friends here in Nicaragua. It's a little different in Nicaragua, but still, if you're a single woman, it's basically impossible. You cannot get a visa, even if you apply legally. And if you're a single man, it's very difficult. So the reality is that these people are fleeing very desperate conditions. So the idea of trying to stabilize Central America is a good one, but we have to look at the devil's in the details. We have to look at the details of Plan Biden. What are the details? The Biden administration says that it's offering $4 billion in investment in Central America. Now, compared to the U.S. wars in Iraq, which is still ongoing, the war in Afghanistan, which is entering its 20th year and still ongoing, the war in Syria, which is ongoing, compared to the war in Yemen, and the other wars that the US is waging, the military wars, the US spends billions of dollars every day. So $4 billion is not that much money. But to be fair, for the context of Central America, these are very poor countries. Central America is one of the poorest regions of the world. $4 billion is a significant estimate. It's a significant sum. But we have to look again at the details. The devil's in the details. And the Biden administration is not giving that money for free. The Biden administration is basing this policy on a policy that began under Obama that Biden himself oversaw. And that was called the Alliance for Prosperity. The Alliance for Prosperity was an attempt, because there was this Central American immigration crisis. The Obama-Biden administration, as it's now referred to, had a policy of sending hundreds of millions of dollars per year into Central America, ostensibly to stabilize the Northern Triangle countries and to stop immigration. Well, we see the results of that. It clearly worked so well because the immigration has continued and only grown. I mean, I'm being sarcastic, obviously. So it didn't work, but the Biden plan is a continuation of that policy. And when you look at what he's actually calling for, it's more neoliberal structural adjustment programs. So it's more cutting programs that would help workers. It's more support for so-called free trade agreements like CAFTA. In fact, Central America is already part of an important free trade agreement with the United States called CAFTA. And that was one of the reasons that fueled progressive movements in the region, specifically here in Nicaragua with the Sandinista government, and in Honduras, where there was a progressive president, Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in a coup in Honduras in 2009. So it's more continuation of these neoliberal policies. And when they call it the Biden plan, the fact that it's based on Plan Colombia is very significant, because Plan Colombia has not stabilized Colombia. Colombia is even more violent now than it was in the 1990s when Bill Clinton began Plan Colombia. So really quickly, I know I'm kind of going really in detail about this, but I think it's an important plan because, as I point out in my article at the Grayzone, the Biden plan has been praised by right-wing leaders in Central America. That's what my article's about. Specifically, the former president of Costa Rica, and the former vice president and current OAS representative from Panama also has praised it. Other right-wing officials from Guatemala, El Salvador. So the right wing in Central America is saying very openly that they support this policy. So we should ask that if the right wing is saying they support it, why are people in the US, why are Democrats pretending that it's anything other than our right-wing policy? Really quickly, just not to, beat this horse dead, but I want to read a few quotes from Plan Biden, because again, you can go to his official campaign website and they go into detail about what their policy proposals are for Plan Biden. And let's keep in mind that this is, I think, just going to give us an idea of the tone in general of US policy toward Latin America. This is not just for Central America. Okay, so these are the priorities and the strategies of Plan Biden. Quote, maximizing our trade and commercial deals also generates greater economic opportunities for US businesses and investors through private sector investment, including through public-private partnerships to supplement government funds. So every time you hear that term, public-private partnership, your eyebrows should go up. I mean, that's exactly what the US has been doing for so many years. In fact, the COVID vaccine policy was a public-private partnership. If you remember when Trump gave his speech announcing, I believe they call it Operation Warp Speed, where if you remember Trump's speech announcing that, he said the phrase public-private partnership 24 times. He just kept saying it. It's part of that neoliberal newspeak. What they mean is giving government money, public money paid by tax dollars to private corporations who pocket the profit. That's exactly, I mean, that's what the US vaccine program has been, by the way, whereas it was developed in China and Russia and Cuba and even India, which has a very right-wing government. But in those other countries, the government helped fund the creation of the vaccine, and it has public involvement. And it's not just all going to profit that people like the Sacklers, like these oligarch capitalists who are responsible for so much misery in the United States and around the world. But anyway, so here are a few other policy objectives of Plan Biden. They say that the administration will, quote, harness private sector investment to promote economic stability and job creation in Central America, end quote, by, quote, reducing the barriers to private sector investment, end quote, and, quote, improving the competitiveness of the Northern Triangle market. Now, I hope it's not just me. When I hear language like that, I immediately think of bankers. I mean, like, what is this? Like, this is supposed to be a progressive democratic administration? No, this is neoliberal propaganda. I mean, when they say they want to reduce the barriers to private sector investment, they mean end any potential policies in Central America that would have protectionist trade measures, any tariffs or anything like that. I mean, there's very few of those policies in place anyway because of the neoliberal trade agreement, CAFTA, because these governments are mostly right wing. When they say improving the competitiveness of the Northern Triangle market, of course, that's pretty clear what they mean by that. They also mean cutting workers' protections, improving the competitiveness by dropping wages. So, I mean, I could go on for this for a long time, but essentially, I think the reason I looked at this in this article and spent so much time reporting on it is that I think it really establishes the tone of the Biden administration. There's one other important detail about this. In this plan, it highly emphasizes microfinance programs. And I think anyone who has ever heard about microfinance programs and even knows a little bit should be really concerned when they hear that. This used to be really popular in like the 90s and early 2000s among these kind of liberal internationalist types who talked about how we can help empower people with microloans and microfinance. The reality of that, if you look at India, which is a classic example, case study of this, the result has been tens of thousands of farmer suicides, a mass epidemic of death in India because there are so many poor people, largely farmers, who are trapped in unpayable debt because they take these micro loans, but they're still loans. I mean, in the US, we have a microfinance program too. It's called the payday loans. That's microfinance, but they're just doing it on an international stage. So they call it micro loans, microfinance. It sounds so nice. I mean, so that's another part of this program. And then finally, NGOs and so-called civil society organizations are part of this. And I mentioned in my article that a former Obama administration official who is now involved in helping craft Latin America policy, he stressed that civil society is going to play a major role. In fact, here's the quote. He said that for the Biden administration, civil society organizations, so-called NGOs, are, quote, the favored interlocutors in the view of the administration in developing and implementing its policies in the region. So there you go. I mean, it's a continuation of the same kind of bipartisan neoliberal policies we've seen that have devastated Latin America, that have devastated Central America, that devastated Mexico when they had decades of neoliberal governments until recently. And we saw the massive immigration crisis after NAFTA, which again, CAFTA and NAFTA are modeled after each other. These are neoliberal trade agreements. NAFTA helped destroy local economies in Mexico, especially the agriculture sector, because you had poor workers in Mexico who were not able to compete with huge big agribusiness corporations, because those corporations, if you know about economies of scale, they operate at such a large scale and have so much product that they can afford, in the short term at least, they can afford losing money in the short term and selling their products for extremely low prices so they can destroy all their competition, who in this case, they would be the local farmers, indigenous campesinos and others in Mexico. And then when they destroy all their competitors and displace them off their land and they take over their land, then they can later on raise the prices because they destroyed all their competitors. So this, for me, is the embodiment of the Biden administration's policy. This answer was really long and I'm ranting, but as I began this answer explaining, the Biden administration has only continued the Trump administration's policy on Venezuela, on Nicaragua, on Colombia, And if you look at what its new policy proposals are for the region, they certainly don't inspire any confidence.